About 9 years ago, I had an experience that still lingers in my mind, stirring up a cocktail of wonder and unease every time I think about it. I was in San Jose, California, a city known for its tech industry, but also its suburban charm. The story I'm about to share happened during one of those warm Californian nights, the kind where the sky is a velvet blanket sprinkled with stars, and the air is tinged with the scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. I was house-sitting for my boyfriend's aunt, who had a lovely home with a spacious backyard fenced in, though parts of the fence were in disrepair. It was one of those cozy, single-story houses you'd find in any suburban neighborhood, with a living room that opened up to the backyard through a large sliding glass door. My boyfriend, Mike, was with me, but at that moment, he was in the bathroom, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room. I remember that night vividly. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. The living room was warmly lit by a single lamp in the corner, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. I walked over to the sliding glass door to peek into the backyard. It was dark outside, the kind of darkness where the trees become indistinct shapes and every rustle of leaves can send your imagination into overdrive. As I stood there, my eyes adjusting to the dark, I suddenly noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Right by the glass door, only a few inches away, was a massive creature. My initial thought was that it was a trick of the light, but as my vision cleared, I realized it was very real and very alive. This animal was enormous, standing on its hind legs and towering at least 6 or 7 feet tall. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, reflecting an eerie, almost intelligent curiosity. It had a hunched back, and its paws were adorned with long, menacing claws. Its hind legs were short and sturdy, giving it a peculiar, somewhat awkward stance. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The creature just stared at me through the glass, and I could feel its gaze piercing into me, as if it was studying me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it a bear? But it didn't look like any bear I'd ever seen. It had an almost prehistoric quality to it, something out of a time long past. Panic surged through me, and I let out a scream that shattered the stillness of the night. The creature seemed unfazed by my reaction. It turned around slowly, almost deliberately, and dropped down on all fours before lumbering off into the darkness of the backyard. I watched it disappear, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I bolted to the bathroom, where Mike was. "Mike, you have to come out here now. I just saw something huge." I was nearly hysterical, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Mike, sensing the urgency in my voice, quickly came out, but by then the creature was long gone. He tried to calm me down, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. To be honest, I wasn't sure if I believed what I had seen either. It was just too bizarre. The next day, in the clear light of morning, I tried to rationalize the encounter. Mike and I talked it over, and the only thing I could come up with was that maybe I had seen a giant raccoon. His aunt had mentioned that raccoons were a common sight in the backyard, attracted by the kibble she left out for stray cats. The night before, we had seen a raccoon by the door, rummaging through the food. Yet, deep down, I knew what I had seen was far larger and more imposing than any raccoon. It had stood on its hind legs, for one thing, and those claws, they were something out of a nightmare. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself, not wanting to seem crazy. I didn't even tell Mike's aunt about it, figuring she would brush it off as a figment of my imagination. It was a warm summer night, and I must have been around 7 or 8 years old when it happened. Now, at 22, the memory still sends a chill down my spine, vivid and unsettling. I was in my bedroom, reluctantly getting ready for bed. My mother was in the living room, probably waiting for my dad to come back from his late shift. The door to my room was closed, and I remember the windows being open to let in the evening breeze. The air was still, and the sounds of the night drifted in. A symphony of crickets and distant traffic, the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog. My room was cloaked in darkness, save for the slivers of moonlight filtering through the curtains and the faint glow of our garden lights outside. The familiar shadows of my room were comforting, but that night, they felt different, more alive. I wasn't particularly tired and wished I could stay up with my parents. I stared at the wall next to my bed, only about a foot away, lost in thought. That's when I saw it, a figure slowly emerging from the shadows, standing and looking directly at me. My heart froze, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The figure was clear, almost tangible, but shrouded in darkness. It was as if the very shadows had taken form. I tried to scream, but for a moment, no sound came out. Then, finally, a piercing scream tore through my silence, echoing through the house. It felt like an eternity before my parents burst into the room, their faces etched with fear and concern. As soon as they entered, the figure vanished, dissolving back into the darkness, leaving me staring at nothing but the wall. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to explain what I had seen. My words tumbled out in a frantic rush, describing the small, cloaked figure with long, slanted black eyes and a hood covering its head. It was dark green or maybe dark gray, with a small, almost non-existent mouth. My parents exchanged worried glances before deciding to call the nearest priest to bless the house and me. That night is burned into my memory. Even though I was so young, I can recall the figure with unsettling clarity. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It felt real, tangible, like something that didn't belong in our world. The same night, I described it as an alien cloaked in black, almost like the Grim Reaper, but smaller, maybe only 5 feet tall. The detail that haunts me the most is the eyes, long, oblique, and black, staring right into me. What puzzles me to this day is why I would imagine an alien in such detail. I had never seen any movies about aliens at that point in my life, nor had I shown any particular interest in them. If you had asked me to draw an alien back then, I probably would have sketched the typical image, a tall, skinny figure with a big head and no clothes. But this was different. This felt deliberate, almost purposeful. I remember every little detail of that night. The way the room smelled faintly of summer air mixed with the earthy scent of the garden outside. The texture of my bedspread under my fingers as I clutched it in fear. The soft hum of the ceiling fan, a sound that usually lulled me to sleep but did nothing to calm my racing heart that night. When my parents finally coaxed the story out of me, their reactions were a mix of disbelief and concern. My mom held me close, her arms a protective cocoon, while my dad paced the room, his mind working overtime to rationalize what I had seen. "It's just a nightmare," he kept saying, more to himself than to me. But I knew it wasn't. I had been wide awake, and I had seen it as clearly as I was seeing them. The priest arrived the next day, a kind old man with a soothing presence. He blessed the house, muttering prayers in a language I didn't understand, but the rhythmic cadence of his words was comforting. He blessed me too, placing a gentle hand on my head and praying for my safety. For a while, it seemed to work. The house felt lighter, the shadows less threatening. But the memory of that figure never left me. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with understanding what I had seen. I would spend hours at the library, flipping through books on paranormal encounters, alien abductions, and anything that might explain the figure. My parents, though supportive, grew worried about my fixation. They wanted me to forget, to move on. But how could I? It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a mystery that demanded answers. As I grew older, the memory faded but never disappeared. It became a story I would occasionally share with friends, usually met with skepticism or nervous laughter. But those who knew me well could see the sincerity in my eyes, the lingering fear that came with the telling. They believed me, or at least they believed that I believed it. I never told anyone this story because, well, who would believe me? It sounds like something ripped straight out of a sci-fi novel or one of those late-night paranormal TV shows. But every time I think back to that night, my heart races and a chill runs down my spine. This wasn't just a dream. It was real, and it changed me in ways I still can't fully understand. It was a warm summer evening, and I was home alone. My significant other, Emily, was out of state on a business trip. We live in a cozy 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood in central Texas, where the summers are blistering and the nights are usually just a tad cooler. I had gone to bed early, trying to catch up on some much-needed sleep. Our 2 indoor cats, Luna and Shadow, were my usual bedtime companions, curling up at the foot of the bed or snuggling next to me. That night, I fell into a deep sleep almost immediately, feeling the familiar weight of the blankets and the soft hum of the ceiling fan lulling me into slumber. But something woke me up in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure of the exact time, but the darkness was absolute and I was freezing. Now, I like it cool when I sleep, typically setting the thermostat to around 70 degrees or even a bit colder. But this was different. My body felt like it had been plunged into an ice bath, despite being wrapped tightly in blankets. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, hoping to check the time and maybe adjust the thermostat remotely. But my phone was off, which was strange because it had been charging all night. I pressed the power button, but it didn't turn on. Still half asleep, I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a glitch. As I got out of bed, I noticed the absence of Luna and Shadow. Usually, they'd be either on the bed or somewhere nearby, but they were nowhere to be seen. Their absence added to the growing sense of unease that was creeping up on me. I decided to check the thermostat manually and headed towards the hallway. The house was eerily silent, not the kind of peaceful quiet you'd expect at night, but a heavy, oppressive silence that felt almost tangible. I reached the thermostat, a sleek Nest model, and tried to adjust it, but the screen was blank. No power. My initial thought was that the house might have lost power, but a quick glance out of the upstairs window showed that the neighbors' outdoor lights were on, casting a dim glow across the street. Their power was fine, so why was mine out? It had only been a couple of minutes since I'd woken up, but it felt like an eternity. I decided to go downstairs to get a glass of water, hoping it would help clear my head. As I approached the stairs, I noticed a faint glow coming from the first floor. This was odd because if the power was out upstairs, why would there be light downstairs? The logical part of my brain couldn't make sense of it. I began descending the stairs, and that's when I heard it, a faint humming sound. It was a high-pitched, almost mechanical whine, interspersed with random low-pitched thumps. It reminded me of a weed whacker being throttled at random intervals, muffled and distant, but unmistakably there. As I continued down the stairs, the glow intensified, casting strange shadows on the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. A dark, slow-moving figure in the living room, illuminated by a soft, otherworldly light. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The figure was vaguely humanoid, but its movements were slow and deliberate, almost as if it were underwater. I took another step, and suddenly, it felt like I had walked off the edge of a cliff. My stomach lurched, and my vision blurred. It was as if the floor had vanished beneath me, and I was falling, or maybe being sucked into some kind of void. The sensation was so disorienting that I lost all sense of time and space. The next thing I remember, I was back in my bed, my phone's alarm blaring beside me. Everything seemed normal. The sun was peeking through the curtains, and the familiar sounds of birds chirping outside filled the air. Luna and Shadow were there, lazily sprawled across the bed, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I sat up, my head spinning, and tried to piece together the events of the night. It felt surreal, like a fragment of a nightmare clinging to the edges of my consciousness. But it couldn't have been a dream. It was too vivid, too detailed. Still groggy, I grabbed my phone and checked the security system app. It logs the time whenever a door is opened or closed, and I wanted to see if anything unusual had happened. To my shock, the system showed that it had been disarmed at some point during the night, and the front door had been opened and closed multiple times. I knew I had armed the system before going to bed. Feeling a growing sense of dread, I pulled up the security footage from the exterior cameras. But there was nothing. The footage cut off around 10 p.m. when a random car drove by, and the next clip was from early the next morning. It was as if the cameras had been deliberately turned off during the crucial hours. Desperate for answers, I called my neighbor, Mark, who had a security camera that pointed towards my house. I made up a story about someone potentially breaking into my truck, hoping he wouldn't think I was crazy. He agreed to check his footage and called me back a few minutes later, sounding perplexed. His cameras, too, had a time gap, as if they had simply stopped recording for a few hours. Nothing before midnight and nothing until dawn. I was at a loss. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. I knew I wasn't a sleepwalker, and this felt far too real to be a dream. Then I remembered something else. The red pickup truck parked the wrong way in front of the neighbor's house. I distinctly recalled seeing it when I looked out the window in the middle of the night. It wasn't there when I went to bed, but it was there in the morning. How could I have seen it if I hadn't been awake? Trying to make sense of it all, I walked through the house, searching for any other signs of disturbance. The front door was securely locked, and there were no obvious signs of a break-in. But then I noticed a few other things that were different. The light downstairs, which I was sure I had turned off before going to bed, was on, and there was a strange smell lingering in the air, like burnt marshmallows. It was faint but unmistakable, clinging to my clothes and skin. I also discovered something even stranger. Our 55-gallon fish tank, which sat at the bottom of the stairs, was missing about 2/3 of its water. The tank was still intact, and the fish were swimming around as usual, but where had the water gone? The area around the tank was completely dry, no sign of any leakage or spillage. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, replaying the events over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to me, something beyond explanation. Emily called to check in that evening, and I debated whether to tell her. I didn't want to worry her, and besides, how could I explain it when I barely understood it myself? In the end, I decided to keep it to myself, at least until I could figure out what was going on. That night, I set up extra cameras and made sure the security system was armed. I even placed a few motion sensors around the house. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but I needed to do something to feel even a little bit in control. I grew up in a nice, upper-middle-class neighborhood, the kind where lawns are always neatly trimmed, kids ride their bikes up and down the streets, and neighbors greet each other with friendly waves. It was a place where crime was almost non-existent, a bubble of safety that cocooned us from the harsher realities of the world. However, even in such idyllic settings, unsettling events can occur, and one such night has stayed with me ever since. I must have been in 4th or 5th grade at the time, so around 10 years old. It was a Friday night, and my parents were out, probably at a movie or visiting friends. I was excited to have the house to myself, a rare opportunity that felt like an adventure. My mom had left me in the family room with a selection of snacks and the TV remote to keep me occupied. The living room was warm and cozy, with a large, plush couch and a big screen TV. I settled in with a bowl of popcorn, ready to enjoy my evening of independence. The hours slipped by as I immersed myself in my favorite shows. The house was quiet, save for the background noise of the television. I was lost in the comforting familiarity of my surroundings when, at around 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It startled me, pulling me out of my reverie. My parents had taught me not to answer the door when they weren't home, so I did exactly that. I stayed put, hoping whoever it was would just go away. But as I sat there, a feeling of unease began to creep over me. Who could it be at this hour? Our neighborhood wasn't known for late-night visitors, and solicitors rarely came around, especially not after dark. I tried to convince myself it was nothing to worry about, just someone at the wrong house or a neighbor needing something. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of dread that settled in my chest. A few moments later, the doorbell rang again, followed by a series of knocks. This time, the sound was more insistent, more demanding. My heart started to race. I tiptoed to the kitchen, trying to be as quiet as possible. The kitchen was directly adjacent to the living room, separated by a small hallway. The shadows in the room seemed darker and more ominous as I reached for the home phone. With the phone in hand, I snuck back to the living room and resumed my spot on the couch, feeling slightly more secure with a potential lifeline at my fingertips. That's when the knocking began. It was loud and persistent, reverberating through the house. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever was at the door wasn't going away. My logical side tried to calm me down, suggesting that maybe it was my parents who had come home early and forgotten their keys. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. They would have called if they needed help getting in. With my heart in my throat, I decided to call my mom. I dialed her number with trembling fingers, praying she would answer. The phone rang, and rang before eventually going to voicemail. Panic started to set in, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself I was being brave, that I could handle this. I was a big kid now, after all. Just then, the knocking turned into pounding. The first bang was so loud it made me jump. All my 10-year-old bravery evaporated in an instant. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and took cover behind the couch with the knife in one hand and the phone in the other. The pounding on the door grew louder and more aggressive, each thud a hammer blow to my nerves. Desperately, I called my mom again. This time, she answered, but her tone was annoyed. She was busy and didn't want to be disturbed. I blurted out that someone was at the door, but she brushed it off, telling me I was being paranoid. Her dismissal stung, but I tried to believe her. Maybe I was overreacting, but the fear gnawing at my gut told me otherwise. The pounding eventually stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the house. I stayed hidden behind the couch for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. Finally, after what seemed like half an hour, I summoned the courage to peek out. The front door was still closed, the house quiet. I slowly got up, my legs shaky, and checked the locks on all the doors and windows. When my parents finally came home, I rushed to tell them what had happened. They looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. My dad went outside to check around the house while my mom tried to reassure me that everything was fine. When my dad came back, he didn't say much, just that we should go to bed and not worry. For years, I was convinced I had imagined the whole thing. My parents never talked about it again, and I tried to push it to the back of my mind. But the memory of that night stayed with me, a lingering shadow of fear. It wasn't until I was 15 that I brought up the incident again. I was talking to my dad about random childhood memories when I mentioned the night of the knocking. To my surprise, his expression changed. He told me that after I went to bed, he had gone outside to investigate further and found a dent and dirt around the handle and lock of the front door. Someone had indeed tried to break in. It was a balmy evening in the middle of summer, the kind where the sun lingers in the sky, painting everything in a warm, golden hue before finally dipping below the horizon. I was 10 years old, filled with the boundless energy and curiosity that define childhood. My younger brother, Tommy, was 7, and we were inseparable, partners in every adventure. Our neighborhood was our kingdom, and the other kids on our block were our loyal subjects. Together, we spent those long, lazy summer days playing games, exploring every nook and cranny, and inventing fantastical stories to fill the hours. That particular day had been especially fun. We played tag, hide and seek, and our own version of baseball until the sun began to set. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, the distant hum of lawnmowers, and the chirping of cicadas. As the sky shifted from orange to deep purple, our friends started heading home, and Tommy and I reluctantly did the same. We walked down the familiar streets, our faces flushed from the exertion, our minds already turning to the evening ahead. Our parents, Lisa and Mark, had developed a bit of a tradition. About once a week, they would go out to a different restaurant in town, enjoying some much-needed adult time. Sometimes they would tell us beforehand, but if we were out playing, they might just leave a note for us to find when we got home. Tonight seemed to be one of those nights. When we pushed open the front door, the house was eerily quiet, and a note on the kitchen counter confirmed our parents were out for the evening. "Guess it's just us, buddy," I said to Tommy, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Even though we were used to being left alone, there was always a small part of me that felt uneasy when our parents weren't home. We settled into our usual routine, TV time in the living room. The comforting glow of the screen and the familiar sounds of our favorite shows quickly put us at ease. The living room was our sanctuary, a cozy space filled with soft furniture and family photos. The windows were open, allowing a gentle breeze to flow through the room, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. As the minutes ticked by, the sky outside darkened, and the house was soon enveloped in night. We were so engrossed in the animated world on the screen that we didn't notice the time slipping away. Then, suddenly, the doorbell rang. Who could that be? I wondered aloud. It wasn't like our parents to use the front door, much less ring the bell, especially when they had a garage door opener. I paused the TV and got up, feeling a knot of anxiety form in my stomach. Tommy looked at me with wide eyes, sensing my unease. "Do you think it's Mom and Dad?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, though I didn't really believe it. "I'll go check." I walked to the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached, I heard a man's voice calling out, "Girl Scout cookies for sale." The voice was too loud, too insistent for this time of night. I peered through the peephole and saw a grown man standing there, alone, with no sign of cookies or a Girl Scout. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. Something about this felt very wrong. The man knocked again, this time more forcefully. I watched in horror as his hand moved to the door handle. In my panic, I realized we had forgotten to lock the door when we came in. The handle began to turn slowly, and I knew I had only seconds to act. I lunged for the deadbolt, twisting it into place with a loud click that seemed to echo through the house. The man must have heard it. I held my breath, praying he would go away. After a moment, I chanced another look through the peephole. The man had moved to the living room window, peering inside. My heart sank as I saw him staring directly at Tommy, who was oblivious to the danger, still focused on the TV. From where the man stood, I noticed something else, a gun holstered at his waist. Fear gripped me like a vice. I needed to get Tommy away from the windows and to safety, but I didn't want to scare him. "Hey, Tommy," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and cheerful. "How about we get some ice cream from the basement?" Tommy looked at me, confused. "Ice cream? But we already had dessert." "Yeah, but it's summer," I said with a forced smile. "And what's summer without extra ice cream, right?" He shrugged and agreed, his young mind easily swayed by the promise of a treat. We headed down to the basement, a cool, dimly lit space that was our makeshift playroom. I locked the basement door behind us as quietly as I could. We sat at the small table in the corner, eating ice cream from the carton. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Should I call the police? What if the man tried to break in? Every noise from upstairs made me jump, but I tried to keep Tommy distracted with silly stories and jokes. Minutes passed like hours. I strained to hear any sounds from above, but it was eerily silent. Then, finally, I heard the hum of the garage door opening. Relief washed over me. Our parents were home. I waited until I heard their voices before taking Tommy upstairs. As we emerged from the basement, my parents looked at us with puzzled expressions. "Why were you guys in the basement?" Mom asked, concern evident in her voice. We were just playing," I said, not wanting to alarm Tommy. I waited until he had wandered off to his room before telling my parents what had happened. Their faces paled as I recounted the events. Dad immediately called the police while Mom hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. The police arrived quickly, inspecting the house and taking our statements. They found signs that the front door lock had been tampered with, confirming my worst fears. The officers assured us they would patrol the neighborhood, but the man was never identified. To this day, I still think about that night, the fear, the quick thinking, and the overwhelming relief when my parents came home. When I was about 11 years old, life was tough. My mom and I lived in a small, one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a shabby building on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheaper up there, and my mom said it was safer too. I didn't mind the climb. It made me feel like we were closer to the sky, closer to something bigger and brighter than the struggles we faced every day. We were poor, but we had each other, and that was enough. Our apartment had these double sliding glass doors in the bedroom that led out to a tiny balcony. The doors were old, the kind that rattled in the wind and never quite locked properly. Mom always said we didn't need to worry about anyone coming in through the balcony because, well, who would be crazy enough to climb up to the third floor? That thought gave me a sense of security, a false one as it turned out. Our sleeping arrangement was a bunk bed, a full-size mattress on the bottom for Mom and a twin on top for me. I liked the top bunk. It felt like my own little fortress. Mom and I had different routines. She loved to watch TV late into the evening, savoring the quiet after a long day of work, while I preferred to retreat to the bedroom with a book. The TV's glow, and distant hum from the living room were comforting reminders that I wasn't alone. One night, I was nestled in the top bunk, half asleep, when I heard Mom's voice, a whisper cutting through the silence. "Sarah," she called quietly. "I'm a light sleeper." So I woke up immediately, heart pounding. Mom never used that tone unless something was wrong. I peered over the edge of my bunk and saw her standing just outside the bedroom doorway, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. "There's someone on the balcony," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "Don't move." My mind raced. Someone on the balcony? How was that even possible? We were on the third floor. I felt a chill run down my spine as I tried to process her words. I turned my head slightly to look at the sliding glass doors. The blinds were drawn, but with the lights from the complex outside, I could see a shadow. It was a man, and he was standing just behind the blinds, his form distorted and eerie. I froze, my heart thudding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The man stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he started knocking on the glass. The sound was deliberate and slow, each knock sending a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't understand how someone could have climbed up there, and I didn't want to think about what he might want. Mom didn't waste any time. She slipped into the kitchen, moving as quietly as possible, and grabbed the phone. I could hear her speaking to the 911 operator, her voice tense but controlled. "There's a man on our balcony," she said, giving our address. "We're on the third floor. Please hurry." I stayed as still as I could, barely daring to breathe. The knocking continued, slow and relentless, each knock a reminder of the danger lurking just a few feet away. It couldn't have been more than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. I closed my eyes, willing the man to go away, to leave us alone. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I opened my eyes and saw that the shadow was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Mom stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, describing what had happened. Within minutes, the police arrived, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. 2 officers came up to our apartment, checking the balcony and the surrounding area. They couldn't find any sign of the man, no evidence of how he might have climbed up. But they did find something that sent another chill down my spine. 2 clear palm prints on the glass, right where he had leaned against the door. The officers assured us they would patrol the area and keep an eye out, but their words did little to comfort me. The image of those palm prints was burned into my mind. That night, I slept in the bottom bunk with Mom, the TV left on for some semblance of comfort.